So good morning, good afternoon, good whatever it is. Just introducing this next unit, promote Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander cultural safety, CHC DIV 002. So the idea of cultural safety is important here, and I guess often when we're talking now about Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander people, we can just use the term First Nations as well. So I just wanted to set the scene primarily in this first video. And I like to draw on experts. I guess I have to acknowledge first up, I'm not Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander person. But yeah, certainly if we want to do that acknowledgement, I can do an acknowledgement of country as an Aboriginal person, just saying, yeah, acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands, in my case here, of the Awabakal people from around Lake Macquarie, western Lake Macquarie at the moment, towards the Wadigan Mountains, as well, acknowledging that we're meeting on the now what we now know the lands of the Awabakal people, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and Aboriginal people amongst us. And I can always, yeah, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And of course, an Aboriginal person, elder, respected person, can do as opposed to an acknowledgement of country, can do a welcome to country. All right, let's have a look there. Cultural safety. There's a couple of questions. So, question one, describe the concept of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural safety. So, there's a little slide, but to me, cultural safety is really about being safe in the workplace. And when I say safe, it's about being able to express yourself, who you are, your cultural identity, maybe your cultural practices, without fear of being ridiculed, putting yourself at disadvantage, excluded, negative attitudes put on you. So cultural safety is a place where anyone can express their cultural ideas without fear of retribution. Question two, describe how cultural safety is related to cultural awareness. So what is cultural awareness? So cultural awareness is knowledge of other cultures, the influences, but also it's important is about your understanding your cultural background, but that means including the biases. And we did speak about in class, and hopefully I've spoken about in my previous video, but the idea that, we're indoctrinated into a society that may create biases, and generally will create some sort of bias. And I spoke about me and my experiences of roles for males and females as I give a gender bias. You hear jokes about certain groups, perhaps the LGBTQIA plus groups, hearing those sort of groups, hearing those sort of jokes or the negative comments. Does that give you a sort of biased view of the world? And so, if you being aware of these biases and getting an understanding that they're based on the negative stereotypes, if you like, putting a negative to a whole group of people. Understanding that and being able to address and work with that, and then once you're getting an understanding of it, people first, difference doesn't equal something terrible, bad, or catastrophic, or it's not a threat to me or anybody else. Difference is to be celebrated in a cultural and human sense. So how does that cultural safety, how is it related to cultural awareness? So I guess having an awareness of who I am, what are my cultural beliefs, what are my backgrounds, what are my biases, does that help me understand what it's like to create a culturally safe workplace? So what do we need? How do we show this is a culturally safe workplace? Is it about, flags, information, different languages, different practices? Is it about acknowledgement of country? And the last one, describe how cultural safety is related to cultural competence. So cultural competence is the knowledge and understanding of other cultures, but not imposing your own views, listening, learning, communicating effectively across cultures. So listening and understanding and not imposing a particular barrow or view. You should do this. Remember I spoke about no shoulds. It's listening and learning, acknowledging perhaps where you don't know and seeking out where you can learn. Cultural competence from the perspective of Daniel Jack, a little slide that I have. So yeah, employing Aboriginal people. Daniel Jack's a worker at TAFE, involved in our Reconciliation Action Plan, RAP, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But Strategies and policies about inclusion. So it's written in that you employ Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people have a role, and this is what their role is. There's cultural awareness training, celebrating events like NAIDOC, which we do have. Targeted courses that promote Aboriginal culture and history. Yes, TAFE's had a good history there, I believe. Use of language. I guess understanding some of the talking about Aboriginal English there, and that's important. I guess in terms of communication, understanding the perhaps different uses of words, deadly as an example, from an Indigenous perspective, the way that might be used. Aboriginal English. Branding and imagery, yeah, so little statements on emails and things like that about acknowledging the traditional owners and acknowledging country we've spoken about as part of general practice. So last slide, cultural competence is characterised by acceptance of and respect of difference, continuing self-assessment regarding culture, careful attention to the dynamics of differences, and continuous expansion of cultural knowledge and resources. So again, that's that self-examination. What do I know? What don't I know? What's my misinformation? Where do I get the good information? What do I do with those negative statements that might be thrown around? And also the last one, again, it's not a law as such, the Reconciliation Action Plan. It's a thing that organisations implement. So TAFE has got one off the ground, not as quick as some organisations, but you can be a little organisation like, let's say, Samaritans or a neighbourhood centre. You can get your own little Reconciliation Action Plan to inform your organisation and how to work best with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, First Nations people. Reconciliation Action Plan. I'm mentioning this because it is significant and important. So I guess we're taking the perspective it's probably a non-Aboriginal service, the way that question has been written. But it could be an Aboriginal specific service. However, I guess it's more applicable to interpret this question that it's a non-Aboriginal service, and you're going to come up with a program. It doesn't say what the program is, but we want to involve Aboriginal people in the thinking behind what you come up with. So let's say it's a program to work with young people, perhaps, who are not attending school, as an example. But we want, I guess we in that example, we may have some young Aboriginal people potentially in that program. So we really got to involve the Aboriginal community in how that would be set up, and that's important. So how do we do that? I'll let you have a think, but I mean, how do we listen to the voices? Do we talk informally with local Aboriginal people? Some of the elders, perhaps. Do we have more formal meetings? And we're looking at how to set up a formal meeting with our agendas and thinking through who we invite and bouncing agendas off them. But yeah, it could be a more formal meeting with Aboriginal elders again, or community, as well as Aboriginal services, getting the input from specific Aboriginal services that I'd mentioned in one of my videos, places like the land councils, Marook up Port Stephens, Darkinjung down Central Coast, Butterbar around Belmont, Swansea. Getting input from those people might be very, very important, as well as there's an Aboriginal family service called Mullumbimba. That would be good. Who else has Aboriginal committees and people? Well, schools do. They have Aboriginal workers, and they have advisory committees in a lot of cases. Thinking more broadly, who do we employ as an organisation? Have we got Aboriginal people working as volunteers and or paid staff? So it really is important that Aboriginal people are employed in all organisations, particularly community services, so involving our Aboriginal staff. Perhaps we have a Reconciliation Action Plan. I just mentioned that earlier. Does that set out guidelines for how to involve and work with Aboriginal people? And I guess the RAP sets up things about how inviting is your organisation. How does it look? Is it got Aboriginal art? Welcome information around language, perhaps. That's the planning, and then in the service delivery, once your program's up and running, getting that feedback, hearing from the participants if we have Aboriginal people participating, getting their feedback and their specific ideas about how engaging, how welcoming, and what could be done better. Reviewing with Aboriginal staff, and again the broader Aboriginal community, whether it is the elders or parents or other people in the community, getting that feedback as the program progresses, and as well perhaps looking at our reconciliation action plan. If we don't have one, have we developed it? And if we have it developed, are we meeting the milestones and the things that we're saying that we're going to do? Having a review. So some sort, and maybe it's some sort of fun events, some sort of, let's come and have a barbecue or something to eat, something informal and relaxed, setting a nice atmosphere if you like, and then having those informal chats in that environment, attending Aboriginal specific celebration or events, NAIDOC, etc., etc. All of those would work. That would take us through to the end of that question. There is one little bonus little video I did find recently from NITV, and it's around that idea of cultural safety. I will put that in here, and I think that's important to again review that idea of cultural safety from an Aboriginal perspective. And I like the idea that this is presented from the idea of even the sporting field as a workplace, if you like, certainly for professional people, but it's certainly a place in the community. But how welcoming and culturally appropriate is it? And they draw on the experience of Adam Goodes in particular, who was basically booed in his workplace and booed into submission and retirement. Anyway, thanks for your time, and toodle pips.
A culturally safe space is one in which a person feels equal and valued, and their culture is acknowledged and respected. For our mob, it means a place where there is no denial of our identity, challenge to our history, or assault on our culture.
Our mob's culture is strong, and football is woven into it. It's in our blood. It binds our communities, so it's vital footy is a safe cultural space.
The ovals, the club rooms and the stands must be places where people come together for the love of the game, what each player brings to the team and what each connected family brings to the club. Football clubs, if done right, become places of belonging. A football club family.
There's a bloody good reason so many of our mobs shine when our culture is celebrated. Ask Eddie Betts, who kicked goal of the year twice in Sir Doug Nicholls' round. Doesn't take a genius to work out that if we feel equal and valued, we can perform at our peak.
Just like Lance Franklin, who has the whole football world willing him to 1,000 goals. Just 20 to go, buddy.
Good things happen in safe cultural spaces. Empowerment flows. From being able to safely represent who you are and where you come from.
There is no doubt we would have more Indigenous players in the league if racism wasn't so prevalent.
Imagine the league we would have, the players we would see. From personal experience, when I was at Swan Districts in Perth, it was one of the happiest times of my life. Why? Because I was accepted for who I was and made to feel so welcome. And I was able just to focus on footy. That's what happens when you feel valued and included.
Building safe cultural spaces starts with being accepting of someone's differences.
It only takes a split second to make someone feel unwelcome, and a split second for someone to put it right. By standing up, showing support and stamping out racism when they see it or hear it straight up.
Because every time racism rears its ugly head, the game risks losing someone. If you can't feel safe whilst playing the game, quite simply, you'll stop playing, and the game will lose its exhilarating Indigenous essence and unique brand of play.
That's how we lost Goodsy. I wonder who else we lost along the way. I wonder how many brilliant juniors were forced to turn their backs on a space that didn't accept them, and in some cases, turn them into someone else they didn't want to be.
The players and the league are making great gains in building safe spaces. The peak rule is a significant part of that, especially because it protects players at local levels too.
Though we all have a part to play, at under 12s, at local games, or in the outer at the G, if you see it, hear it, or read it online, call it out. Because there's only one way to build a truly safe cultural space, and that's together.
The rewards are everyone's to share. This is Yokai Footy.
And as I guess, drawing on the experience and knowledge of others is really important in this unit, obviously, but I like to draw on music. It's been a big educator for me. As a young fellow, hear lyrics from certain songs, in particular in my case, Warrumpy Band, Goanna. Warrumpy was singing about things about the importance of land and culture and singing in Indigenous language. It was a real eye-opener for me and starting to question what was this all about. This for me, new knowledge I certainly wasn't getting in the classroom. Anyway, I guess when I introduced cultural diversity, and Bella will know this, and the others that were in that group obviously too, but I started with the lyrics from Archie Roach's song, Took the Children Away, which is around 30 years old now, certainly iconic, and that experience of his experience of what it was like to be one of the stolen generations. And, you know, when he first started performing that in Sydney, I believe, or Melbourne, wherever he performed those lyrics publicly, people would come to him and say, Archie, how did you know that story? And he'd say, no, that was my story. And I guess there was a realisation that, hang on, that story or that experience of being removed was a common experience. So I've got a few of the lyrics, not the whole song, but if you get a chance to Google Archie Roach and Took the Children Away, please do so. I think that's a great starting point for anyone's journey if you haven't heard it. But where we're going to start now, something a little bit more, well, modern twist to an older song, another great song that educated me around the land rights movements, Paul Kelly and Kev Carmody's song From Little Things Big Things Grew. Here's a modern take on that by a Aboriginal fellow called Ziggy Ramo, and he is performing with Paul Kelly on ABC. I think it's called The Set. Listening to the lyrics, it's a history lesson.
Gather round people and I'll tell you a story. 200 years of history that's falsified. British invaders that we remember as heroes. Are you ready to tell the other side? We started our story in 1493 with a piece of paper called the Doctrine of Discovery, invoked by Pope Alexander VI. Without this good Christian, our story don't exist.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
Captain James Cook, he boarded a fleet, and he was armed with the Doctrine of Discovery. The same tactics were used by Columbus. It's how today Australia claims terra nullius. 'Cause on that paper, the Pope did write that you're only human if you've been saved by Christ. And if there are no Christians in sight, the land you stumble on becomes your God-given right.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
Is that your Lord? 'Cause that's invasion. That's the destruction of 500 nations. That's the genocide of entire populations, which planted the seeds for the stolen generation and grew into my people's mass incarceration. Now we pass trauma through many generations, but the Lord can't discover what already existed. For 200 years, my people have resisted.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
The war's continued since Captain James Cook, and this side of history you don't write in your books. You don't want the truth, and you don't want to listen. But how can you stomach Australia's contradiction? 'Cause we went to war in 1945. We were allies against a terrible genocide. And I know it's uncomfortable, but the irony I see is that you fought for them, but you don't fight for me.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
We should move on. Move on to what? 'Cause I still remember. Have you forgot that Vincent Langari knew others were rising? Gurindji inspired us to keep on fighting. So call it Australia, go and call it what you like. I just call it how I see it, and I see genocide. Now that you hear me, can you understand? There can never be justice on our stolen land.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
This is the story of so-called Australia, but this is the story of so much more. How power and privilege cannot move my people. We know where we stand in our law.
From little things, big things grow. 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 From little things, big things grow.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.
Since 1991, 441 Indigenous Australians have died in custody. They're casualties of a war that never ended. But we are not yet defeated. Always was, always will be. Sovereignty was never ceded.
So there we go, pretty powerful song, or another powerful song from an Indigenous person, Ziggy Ramo, as I said, from up near Belgian Way, I believe, accompanied by Paul Kelly, writer, along with Kev Carmody of the original from Little Big Things, but another fine song, a history lesson. Hopefully you picked up a little bit of stuff along the way. He mentions towards the end, since 1991, 441 Aboriginal people have died in custody. And that's following on, there was an inquiry around 1988 to 1991 called the Inquiry into the Black Deaths in Custody, and made a lot of recommendations. However, have we addressed that issue? Certainly the evidence is no. And we had those big marches and protests last year, about a year ago. Actually, it was winter last year from memory. And looking at, again, putting that on the political agenda, the Aboriginal deaths in custody. He talks about the amount of nations and language groups, so 500 nations. So there's a map that I gave out, and there's a copy on the screen of kind of the allocation of traditional Indigenous language groups or nations, so 500. I won't get into too much, but it just shows the diversity, if you like. You're talking about Indigenous diversity, a big country from one side to the other. Obviously similarities between groups, and interaction and trade and ceremony between groups. However, some differences as well, including language and, traditional boundaries and land and things like that. Another thing that I'd like to mention, his last lyric was around sovereignty was never ceded, so meaning that Indigenous people by no way, or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, never ever said to European invaders, have the land, you can take the land. There was no treaty, no discussion, so it was, all actions, all invasion was based on that idea of terra nullius, that it was a vacant and empty land that nobody was using. So your own cultural values and beliefs. So we spent a little bit of time exploring, cultural values and beliefs. So And I guess you see a good snapshot or range in the Briggs stuff on the weekly. So you've got Kyle Sanderlands, his perspective, it's just history, happened a long time ago, doesn't impact anyone. That's a belief, I guess. Whereas Briggs would beg to differ that it's been an ongoing rolling effect of upheaval, change and dispossession. That's intergenerational trauma is a real thing, and I don't believe that Kyle Sanderlands has acknowledged that or understands that. I guess I sort of raised the issue: could I be thinking as a white person that I shouldn't be involved in Indigenous services? However, that was, that might be an extreme and ineffective thinking. So it might be that I need to ensure that I work collaboratively and get input and ask from Indigenous people, Indigenous workers, and make sure that I'm really aware and getting good feedback of any biases. Western systems and work practices. So Western systems could be quite inflexible. Things like leave, and I just mentioned earlier that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people may have complex time constraints sometimes around sorry business or funerals, and that might mean travelling away, taking time off. Is that embedded into our leave system? I doubt it. We're quite regimented, perhaps, Western systems. Maybe Western systems are very hierarchical. There's a boss and, there's a lot of policies and procedures and the right way to do it and the right way to write things. Aboriginal people might be more about sharing knowledge, sharing power, and be more collective and be more about doing and talking and interacting. And, the complex nature of some of the paperwork might be seen as secondary importance to actually connecting and working with people, and I can relate to that. However, the way our government works or our funding system works in community services, it might be paperwork first, it almost appears at times. So some of those Western systems are very bureaucratic, often driven by European values, I guess, white middle-aged people, if we think about a lot of the politicians and male as that, and very much about putting values on being the top of the tree, the best, and being the boss and having almighty power. And that may be at odds with doing good work with Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities. A segment from The Drum, ABC The Drum, 7th of June 2021, and this is really good segue into the next section, but this is a young Aboriginal woman who studied in Newcastle Uni and is now a lawyer. Let's just hear her experiences of the education system and the university system, and I guess those structures like that you might find in education.
We're talking here about, Brendan brought up the whole thing of ATARs and the pressure of tests and ranks and exams. And your story is so stunning because you say that you didn't pass a single assessment when you were at school and that you were put in a pathways program, right? Because school just didn't work for you. It was a difficult time. Mm. Tell us about how, now you're a lawyer. Tell us about how you moved forward from that pathway of school.
Yeah, so I failed every year 11 and 12 legal studies assessment. And I'm talking every exam, every assessment, essay, you name it, all in legal studies. But I was still determined to go to uni. And Newcastle University ended up reaching out to me and asking, come try this pathways program called YPUG, which is an Awabika word for pathway. And so I did. And that whole pathways program was shaped around Black academics. Mm. And that was a pivotal moment for me. I remember my lecturer finished class early so we could go into town to stop the forced closures of Aboriginal communities, to protest. Mm. And I found myself at the front of the protest and I thought, you know what, I am smart enough to do law. And then a year later, at my final year of law school, I ended up topping the class for advanced legal writing and research and going on to write a PhD. So it's been quite a ride.
That's actually amazing. What was it about, like, taking you to the protest? Do you think this was the teacher recognising something in you, or like maybe stitching knowledge and saying, this isn't some abstract thing, this really matters in the world, this is important, this can be a weapon?
Yeah, it was. It was. And there was one case, that same lecturer, Dr. Charlene Leroy Dyer, I remember submitting an assignment and she looked at it and she said, you know what, Taylor, you can do better than this. And I thought to myself, you know what, I can do better than this. And she let me resubmit, even though it was past the due date. And I went from a credit to a high distinction. And I thought, you know what, I backed myself because I had a teacher that believed in me. And I had the same laptop from year 11 when I was given, you know, a scholarship, all the way to my final year of law school. Yeah, that laptop got you all the way through. Now, Brendan, you were nodding so vigorously when you hear that story. Tell us why.
I just love that story because it highlights the fact that the school system and the way its assessment works isn't always a good indicator of success. And I think Taylor used the word smart when she's sort of thinking, oh, I am smart enough to be a lawyer. And it breaks my heart to think that we have events occurring in schools, for example, maybe not doing well on an essay, that can be so damaging to young people's self-esteem and sense of self, where they think, well, I'm not smart. And I just think it's such a beautiful story for Taylor to have that moment later on with the right mentoring and with the right pathways, where she realised that she could be this version of herself that she aspired to, and that story I'll be telling to my students next week, definitely. There we go.
And can I just add to that? I think the breaking point, like what really got me through was that Pathways program, which, you know, was a free Pathways program, which the Liberal government was going to cut once upon a time, or they were going to cap it for $5,000. And it's that, you know, we see a correlation between poverty and education. And if First Nations people and children, you know, who experience poverty don't have access to educational pathway programs like this, they will fall through the gaps.
What I should say is, when you're listening to this shortish speech by Stan, not too long, but take some notes of he goes through the events. So that'd be good. Over to you, Stan.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming along this evening, and I would also like to extend my respects to my Gadigal brothers and sisters from my people, the Wiradjuri people. In the winter of 2015, Australia turned to face itself. It looked into its soul and it had to ask this question: who are we? What sort of country do we want to be? And this happened in a place that is most holy, most sacred to Australians. It happened on the sporting field. It happened on the football field. Suddenly the front page was on the back page. It was in the grandstands. Thousands of voices rose to hound an Indigenous man, a man who was told he was an Australian, a man who was told he was an Australian of the Year. And they hounded that man into submission. I can't speak for what lay in the hearts of the people who booed Adam Goodes, but I can tell you what we heard when we heard those boos. We heard a sound that was very familiar to us. We heard a howl. We heard a howl of humiliation that echoes across 2 centuries of dispossession, injustice, suffering, and survival. We heard the howl of the Australian dream, and it said to us again, you're not welcome. The Australian dream. We sing of it and we recite it in verse. Australians all, let us rejoice, for we are young and free. My people die young in this country. We die 10 years younger than average Australians, and we are far from free. We are fewer than 3% of the Australian population, and yet we are 25%, a quarter of those Australians, locked up in our prisons. And if you are a juvenile, it is worse, it is 50%. An Indigenous child is more likely to be locked up in prison than they are to finish high school. I love a sunburned country, a land of sweeping plains, of rugged mountain ranges. reminds me that my people were killed on those plains. We were shot on those plains. Disease ravaged us on those plains. I come from those plains. I come from a people west of the Blue Mountains, the Wiradjuri people, where in the 1820s the soldiers and settlers waged a war of extermination against my people. Yes, a war of extermination. That was the language used at the time. Go to the Sydney Gazette and look it up and read about it. Martial law was declared and my people could be shot on sight. Those rugged mountain ranges, my people, women and children, were herded over those ranges to their deaths. The Australian dream. The Australian dream is rooted in racism. It is the very foundation of the dream. It is there at the birth of the nation. It is there in terra nullius, an empty land, a land for the taking. 60,000 years of occupation. A people who made the first seafaring journey in the history of mankind. A people of law, a people of lore, L-O-R-E, a people of music and art and dance and politics. None of it mattered because our rights were extinguished because we were not here according to British law. And when British people looked at us, they saw something subhuman, and if we were human at all, we occupied the lowest rung on civilization's ladder. We were fly-blown Stone Age savages, and that was the language that was used. Charles Dickens, the great writer of the age, when referring to the noble savage of which we were counted among, said it would be better that they be wiped off the face of the earth. Captain Arthur Phillip, a man of enlightenment, a man who was instructed to make peace with the so-called natives in a matter of years, was sending out raiding parties with the instruction, bring back the severed heads of the black troublemakers. They were smoothing the dying pillow. My people were rounded up and put on missions from where, if you escaped, you were hunted down, you were roped and tied and dragged back. And it happened here. It happened on the mission that my grandmother and my great-grandmother are from at Warringezda on the Darling Point at the Murrumbidgee River. Read about it. It happened. By 1901, when we became a nation, when we federated the colonies, we were nowhere. We're not in the Constitution, save for race provisions, which allowed for laws to be made that would take our children, that would invade our privacy, that would tell us who we could marry and tell us where we could live, the Australian dream. By 1963, the year of my birth, the dispossession was continuing. Police came at gunpoint, under cover of darkness, to Mapoon, an Aboriginal community in Queensland, and they ordered people from their homes, and they burned those homes to the ground, and they gave the land to a bauxite mining company, and today those people remember that as the night of the burning. In 1963, when I was born, I was counted among the flora and fauna, not among the citizens of this country. Now, you will hear things tonight, you will hear people say, but you've done well. Yes, I have. And I'm proud of it. And why have I done well? I've done well because of who has come before me. My father, who lost the tips of 3 fingers working in sawmills to put food on our table because he was denied an education. My grandfather, who served to fight wars for this country when he was not yet a citizen and came back to a segregated land where he couldn't even share a drink with his digger mates in the pub because he was black. My great-grandfather, who was jailed for speaking his language to his grandson, my father, jailed for it. My grandfather on my mother's side, who married a white woman who reached out to Australia, lived on the fringes of town until the police came, put a gun to his head, bulldozed his tin humpy and ran over the graves of the 3 children he buried there. That's the Australian dream. I have succeeded in spite of the Australian dream, not because of it, and I have succeeded because of those people. You might hear tonight, but you have white blood in you. And if the white blood in me was here tonight, my grandmother, she would tell you of how she was turned away from a hospital giving birth to her first child because she was giving birth to the child of a black person. The Australian dream. We're better than this. I have seen the worst of the world as a reporter. I spent a decade in war zones from Iraq to Afghanistan and Pakistan. We are an extraordinary country. We are in so many respects the envy of the world. If I was sitting here where my friends are tonight, I would be arguing passionately for this country. But I stand here with my ancestors and the view looks very different from where I stand. The Australian dream. We have our heroes. Albert Namatjira painted the soul of this nation. Vincent Lingiari put his hand out for Gough Whitlam to pour the sand of his country through his fingers and say, "This is my country." Kathy Freeman lit the torch to the Olympic Games, but every time we are lured into the light, we are mugged by the darkness of this country's history. Of course racism is killing the Australian dream. It is self-evident that it's killing the Australian dream. But we are better than that. The people who stood up and supported Adam Goodes and said no more, they are better than that. The people who marched across the bridge for reconciliation, they are better than that. The people who supported Kevin Rudd when he said sorry to the stolen generations, they are better than that. My children and their non-Indigenous friends are better than that. My wife, who is non-Indigenous, is better than that. And one day I want to stand here and be able to say as proudly and sing as loudly as anyone else in this room, Australians all, let us rejoice. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Stan. So I just started with this brief overview or statement from the Fred Hollows Foundation website. A few facts. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have on average 2.3 times the disease burden of non-Indigenous people. Life expectancy gap is still 10 years between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and almost half of Aboriginal men and over a third of Aboriginal women die before they turn 45, and I find that quite an alarming statistic, that one in itself. I sort of did this as a whole and looked also at the next question, intergenerational trauma, and how that also links to health. So the idea of intergenerational trauma. We started with this little video, so have a listen to this.
Imagine a line of well-being. You have ups and downs, and that's normal. Before colonisation, Aboriginal people also had their ups and downs, but overall our spirit was strong. Aboriginal people had a strong culture for tens of thousands of years. When the dominant culture arrived and they took over our land without our permission, the process of dispossession began. The loss of land and disruption to our way of life, ignoring the things most sacred to our culture, including our family kinship systems, language, traditional law, cultural practices, and looking after country. The dispossession brought massacres, poisoning, and disease. We lost our freedom, physical safety, and health, all of which impacted on our well-being. They introduced legislation and policies to assimilate us, with the ultimate aim to breed Aboriginal people out of existence. They even took our children from us. We lost the right to move freely in our own country and to see our family. We did not have access to legal systems. We were not allowed to get an equal education or receive equal health care. They took half our earnings and we had to get permission to marry. Our basic human rights were denied. All of this pain and loss can break your spirit. No matter where you are in the world, no matter what colour your skin is or how civilised you think you are, if people no longer have those basic human rights, their well-being will plummet. And this is exactly what happened to us as Aboriginal people. The well-being of whole families and communities through generation after generation suffered. Despite all of this, Aboriginal people endured, and through the resilience of our spirit, we survived. Slowly, policies and practices began to change, and the journey of our recovery begins. But it's not an easy thing to overcome, and many of our people are still living in a place of despair and hurt. When you are oppressed on such a large scale and for so long, a lot of despair builds up. Eventually, you start to normalise that. This is how it is for our people. The oppression has become internalised. When people go through trauma, they often rely on their family and friends to be the strong rocks that support them and help them to recover. But what happens when everyone around you is also going through the same trauma? Those rocks, that you try to hold on to pull yourself up, are also crumbling. And like all human beings, what we don't heal in our own lives, we sometimes pass on to our children. When there is internalized oppression and low well-being for generation after generation, along with a society that views you with negative stereotypes, racism and prejudices, it may lead to family violence, alcohol and drug use, incarceration, illness, mental health issues, and low emotional and social well-being, even suicide. Children who are born into this environment might not always have the same opportunities and may start to view the world as harsh and cold instead of feeling love, warmth and security. This is called intergenerational trauma. Now, don't get me wrong, our people are strong and resilient, and there are plenty of us living happy and healthy lives with strong connection to our families, community and culture. But many of us have family and friends who are struggling, and when we try to help pull them out, it can be very easy for us to get pulled back in. Let's think about the economy for a moment. The white man comes to our country, and with them, they bring a whole new social and economic system. Our people were stopped from doing things our way, even though it had been working well for us for a long time. Yet we were also locked out of the new systems. This systematic exclusion from the economy and social systems throughout multiple generations has led to the many disparities in the social determinants of well-being that our people are challenged with today. Over time, there have been other cultures that have migrated to Australia, who have also been subjected to discriminatory legislation, like the White Australia policy. They too have experienced racism and discrimination. However, unlike our people, they were allowed to stay together, keep their children, maintain their cultural ways, and participate in the economy. Whereas our mob has only been allowed to participate in the last 40 to 50 years. As we can see, it's a big and complex challenge that we are facing. Even after the policies of colonisation ended, the trauma of these policies and practices still echo down the generations. I'm not talking about ancient history either. Some people say, it happened 200 years ago, get over it. Sure, the oppression may have started 200 years ago, but it has only started to change recently, less than 50 years ago. The last of the 1905 Act was only repealed in 1964 and the Native Welfare Act in 1972. So when were your parents born? When were you born? Many people living today are survivors of those oppressive legislations. The struggle to heal communities and achieve self-determination and equity takes time. The impacts of past policies are still felt today. And now we live in a contemporary society, but there are new policies and legislation that still impact negatively on Aboriginal people. We also need to change society's negative stereotypes and attitudes towards Aboriginal people. Participating in modern Australia shouldn't mean that we have to forget our culture. In fact, quite the opposite. We know that strengthening, reclaiming and reviving our culture and language builds our resilience and is healing for our people. Many of our mob are healing and living strong and healthy lives with a strong connection to our culture. We can still go hunting. We just might use a four-wheel drive to get there and be using the latest fishing rod instead of a spear. We can still have a strong spiritual connection to our country and the land. We can still speak our language, sing and dance, have ceremonies, paint our pictures and pass our stories to our young ones. We can still respect our elders, share tucker with our family and loved ones and care for our kin. We can maintain our cultural and social obligations to family, community and country and be respected as the first people of this nation. We can live and thrive in modern Australia as equals. That's what Aboriginal well-being is. So how long does it take for people to recover from this trauma and the lasting effects of colonisation and dispossession? Well, we actually do have some idea. Because unfortunately, people have been oppressing each other and inflicting trauma on each other's cultures all around the world for centuries. The evidence tells us that the impacts of trauma on the individual may be felt for many generations after the initial trauma. So if we know that on an individual level the trauma impacts on future generations, what are the effects of the trauma inflicted on a whole race of people for multiple generations? We can assume that it might take a lot longer to recover. But our people's spirit is strong, and we are recovering. However, it is important to remember that right now in Australia, we are smack in the middle of a transition phase. We know that recovering from colonisation and dispossession is a process that takes time. But through engagement, partnerships, and systemic change to attitudes and policies, we can speed this process up. What does this mean? It means recognition of Aboriginal people as the first people of this nation, engagement and partnerships to support Aboriginal-led community-controlled initiatives, building sustainability through increased education and workforce opportunities, addressing the social disparities and providing equitable access to services, ensuring that there is a broader understanding of Aboriginal culture and history in schools, universities and workplaces, providing culturally safe services that challenge racism, systemic bias and stereotypes, recognition and support for cultural strengths that contribute to well-being, helping to maintain, reclaim and revive Aboriginal culture and language, strengthen Aboriginal people's basic human right of self-determination and equity, and sharing the vision of all Aboriginal people living long, well and healthy lives.
Just this slide here, so trauma, so poor mental health and substance abuse we've spoken about, but issues with child health, and we've just touched upon that idea of hearing, speech and vision could be impacted upon. Poverty, housing, money concerns in terms of family functioning and support networks. So if other people in your network are in trauma or not functioning well, that you don't necessarily have good support networks. Perhaps, it leads to poor parenting practices, but just that exposure overall to racism and being on the margins. So that's impacting on setting up that trauma, and the idea of intergenerational trauma, so adults passing on that trauma to children. On the decision making, so that's that first slide in question 9. So particularly for children, if you're in that high stress environment, your survival instincts can kick in, and the flight or fight or heightened sense of arousal continuously, you're on the edge, you're wondering what's going to happen next, am I in danger, do I have to flee, all those sorts of things that might be the experience from a young age of children who are in families that are going through trauma. It could impact on healthy brain growth, according to Atkinson here, but your memory, ability to organise and remember details could be compromised from childhood, so that's going to impact on your ability to make decisions. Your adults with unresolved trauma, so we've gone through all that, but that can, your heart and your stroke and your cancer and your diabetes. Cancer is one that I don't think I mentioned previously. We did have mentioned alcohol, mental health and violence, and that, looks at that pathway into the juvenile justice and the adult correctional systems is certainly a byproduct in many ways of that unresolved trauma and the impact that can have on people's functioning. And so if we look at the communication and trauma, so that's the second part of that table in 9. So from that specific website cited below, Trauma Informed Services in Indigenous Australian Children, so willingness to trust and engage. So if you're in that high trauma environment, that level of mistrust and unwillingness to engage with mainstream services we've spoken about previously is a byproduct of trauma and communication. And if your brain is impaired because of trauma, again, that ability to remember stuff and communicate appropriately can be compromised. Understanding and retention and the link to trauma. Just that idea again of memory and retaining information as a byproduct of being in that high state of arousal and tension, not being able to concentrate, pay attention, and just impacting on understanding generally. That could be certainly the experience, imagine, in school, and I guess not unlike ADHD in some ways, but just trying to engage and concentrate and think. Okay guys, that should take us through to question 10. List 2 current federal and 1 current state piece of legislation, that's law, aimed to ensure cultural safety for Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people in the workplace. So federal legislation, that's also could be called Commonwealth legislation or Australian legislation. So the first one I've got here is the Racial Discrimination Act. So that's Commonwealth or federal or Australian law. So it applies to the whole of Australia, not just you could be in any state, but it's against the law to exclude people from workplaces or education based on their colour, their race, their heritage, and allowed to talk about those groups, diverse groups, based on hate speech, based on race, colour, descent, etc. All that sort of stuff is inbuilt into that, and really important around employment and access to housing, renting, all those sorts of things would come under that Racial Discrimination Act. So you really only got to name the act. Another Australian or Commonwealth legislation, Human Rights Commission Act 1986. So again, it's Australian legislation, and really that is about ensuring, investigating complaints of breaches against human rights. So again, that could be based on your cultural difference. So you might have heard about the Australian Human Rights Commission. There's a website you could look at there and talks about what they do, but where complaints are investigated and dealt with. The Commission against that Human Rights Act. Another federal or national piece of legislation, Native Title Act 1993. This is the Eddie Malbo case, if you like, which in a sense proved that terra nullius, that Australia was a vacant land not being used, was wrong, and it sort of opened the doors for Aboriginal people to make land rights claims, but the land has to be not being used and has been vacant and empty and or not being used for any other, commercial or residential purposes. And Aboriginal people need to show that they've maintained that lifelong connection, that historical and current connection to the land, ongoing and unbroken connection. It does guide, claims for land, but it's very doesn't certainly open up, claiming land here, there and everywhere, Certainly very restrictive and guided. Some New South Wales legislation, and I think it only asks for one. There's the New South Wales Aboriginal Language Act, fairly recent, 2017, and it acknowledges the significance of Aboriginal language. I think what's important there is that we're starting to see more Aboriginal language organisations and courses being taught. Certainly in TAFE in Western New South Wales around Dubbo, there's Aboriginal language courses. Certainly locally in Newcastle, there's an organisation that is teaching and working with the local Awabakal language in particular. Miramar is the organisation, and but we've heard examples from people in class about their schools doing things like singing the national anthem in Awabakal. Here's a little action, Commonwealth Government action. It's not a law as such, but it's important to note the Closing the Gap initiative. So that's where, the statistical measures, how Aboriginal people are faring each year in terms of education as children and childhood, through to secondary and tertiary education, employment outcomes, death rates, health, all those sorts of things. So it's not a law, but it's a government initiative and an action that's been ongoing, and certainly guides and informs if we're doing a good job or a better job. Certainly need to do a better job.